Hey guys, in this tutorial I want to show you how to make these really pretty yarn rainbow cookies. And there are a couple tricks to making a really pretty embroidered cookie and making it look realistic. And the first trick is to get the icing consistency perfect. And the icing consistency that I make when I do any sort of embroidered cookie like these yarn rainbow cookies is a piping consistency that's really similar to a toothpaste consistency. So it has a soft peak that curls back on that spoon, but the icing doesn't flow back into itself. So this is the perfect consistency for any sort of embroidery on a cookie. So since I have the right consistency, I'm going to start putting my icing into piping bags. And I like to put that piping bag in a cup and fold the edges down so that my bag stays nice and clean. So here I have my white uncolored icing. I'm going to go ahead and make a few more colors. For these cookies, you can make however many colors you like. You can make them bright colors or neutral colors. I'm doing something kind of in the middle for these. The next tip for a really perfect embroidered cookie is to get the piping tip of your bag really, really small. So what I do is I flatten the bag down with the seam of the bag facing up towards me, and I cut a really, really, really tiny hole. It's always best to start small because you can cut it bigger if you need to. So I'm going to test this on the side of my cookie, or just to the side of my cookie, and you can see that line is so thin, it's about a millimeter wide. So that hole on that bag is so teeny tiny. I'm going to show that to you again. And you might notice that you'll have some air trapped in the tip of your bag, and that's pretty normal. So what I like to do is I like to cut a really small hole just to push the air out, and then it'll make it really easy to flatten with the seam facing up. And once again, cut a really small hole, and you can see that that hole was too small. So I'm going to cut it a little bit bigger. Again, you can always cut it bigger, but you can never make that hole smaller. And if you're having trouble getting the icing to come out of your piping bag, use your fingers to kind of pinch your piping tip or the tip of your piping bag just to help get that flow of the icing started. Now, if you've ever made a yarn rainbow, like a real yarn rainbow, or seen one, you know that what they're doing is they're actually embroidering over like ropes of yarn. And so what I want to do for this cookie is I want to give this cookie a little bit more dimension. So I'm creating kind of a mound of icing that will be underneath the embroidery. So first what I do is, as you see here, I'm outlining each of the stripes of the rainbow. So I am picking my colors. I picked out my colors. I wanted to start with like a yellow and then an orange and then work towards, I think the interior color of this rainbow is blue. So I'm just making those kind of the stripes of the rainbow first by outlining them with my piping consistency icing. And then I'm going to go in and fill them so that they have a nice kind of rounded shape to them, and I'll embroider or pipe my embroidery icing over top, if that makes sense. It'll make more sense as I go through this cookie. I just kind of wanted to explain why I'm doing that. And you'll also notice that I'm piping the bottom of one line right next to the top of the next kind of stripe in the rainbow, so that I have two lines kind of making the barrier of each of those sections. And the reason I'm doing that and leaving a slight gap in between them is because I'm going to want a little bit of space as I create my embroidery across. And this will make more sense when you see it in action. You don't have to do it if it's really hard to pipe those two lines right next to one another, but it will help to kind of have that little bit of a trench between each of the stripes. So now before I do anything else, I'm going to actually add the yarn that's coming out of the bottom of those ropes that are underneath the embroidery. So I'm just taking my piping consistency white or uncolored icing, and I'm making very rough kind of stripes or squiggles of icing to kind of look like the rope that's coming underneath, or the yarn that's kind of fraying out underneath. So now I'm taking flood consistency icing. You could use a thinner piping consistency icing. It really doesn't matter as long as you can get a nice mounded shape between those two piping lines that you made earlier. It doesn't matter what consistency you use. Flood consistency or anything really thin might make craters, and actually that's fine too because you're going to be piping over top. So any imperfections in this icing doesn't matter. So I piped every other line first, or I filled every other line first, and I let that crust over for about 10 minutes. And then I flooded the next few lines, just so that they're nice and distinct and that there's still a little bit of a trench between each of those stripes in the rainbow. And once that icing has dried completely, which will take at least 4 hours, if not overnight, you can start piping on top to create that embroidery look. So to do that, I'm taking my very, very fine piping tip and piping tiny lines across the stripe of the rainbow, the first stripe or the interior stripe. You can start on the inside or the outside. It really doesn't matter. I do find that it's helpful to make some guidelines going across the stripe just to help kind of visualize where you need to start angling the lines to make it look like a curved embroidered rainbow. And you can see that those lines aren't right next to one another. I'm leaving a teeny tiny space in between, basically the space of another line. And the reason I'm not piping the lines right next to one another is just in case the icing is a little too thin, it might start to meld together. And this icing, because you're working with such a small piping tip, the icing, you don't want the icing super thick, so it could start to blend together and you won't get those really distinct lines. So I pipe the lines a little bit apart to begin with, and then I'll go over top and you'll see me go back over and pipe in between each of those lines that I'm creating. So now I'm going right back in the middle of those lines so that I have a line right next to each line, so it looks like it's embroidered. And if you haven't worked a lot with piping consistency icing, it can be a little bit tricky to get the icing to actually stick to the cookie. So what I'm doing is I'm actually tapping the tip of the piping tip down on that original piped line on the very inside, and then I bring it up and over and I'm kind of tapping it back down on that other line that I made at the very beginning. And that's why that little trench between the two stripes is so helpful, because you're kind of pushing the piping tip down into the trench between the stripes. And that will help you tap the icing down and make it so that it sticks essentially to the cookie. So now the first stripe is done, and before moving on to the next stripe, I always recommend clearing out the tip of the piping bag, just because that piping consistency icing can harden or dry in such a small piping tip that you want to make sure it's cleared out so that you get a nice even line. If you have any sort of obstruction in that piping tip, it could make kind of a funny line, or it could curl even the icing coming out of that piping bag, or it could make it so that the lines that you're making break a lot more. It's pretty normal to have your lines break anyways when you're making such tiny fine lines, but if you have any sort of dried icing in there, it could make it even worse. So now I'm moving along at super speed. This video is sped up about 1,000%, because this is not a quick process. I think each embroidered cookie took me about 30 to 40 minutes a piece. Of course, towards the end I got even faster, but these are a labor of love for sure, but they are worth it because the detail is so realistic. And that's kind of why I love embroidery cookies so much, is even though they are a little bit tedious at times, they can really look like an embroidered yarn rainbow, which is really cool. So one of the things that people ask me a lot when I do embroidery is what size piping tip, and I think they mean the piping nozzle, so those metal piping tips that you can put in any sort of piping bag. And the reason I don't use piping tips or piping nozzles like that is because they do tend to get backed up, or the icing dries in the piping tip, and it's much harder to clear out in a metal piping tip than it is for a tipless bag like this. But if you are somebody who only uses piping tips or piping nozzles, I would recommend a size 1 or even a 1S for those who use Wilton piping tips. You want the smallest piping tip possible, and then just be prepared that you're going to have to clean that piping tip out a lot as you go through, especially when you transition between colors and you're using a new piping bag. So that's why I really do recommend using a tipless bag like this. It just makes it so much easier. They're easier to clean, all that fun stuff. So I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new about this technique. I get lots of questions about it, so I'm so happy I could share all my tips and tricks with you. And if you want to see more tutorials like this, hit the subscribe button below.